Well, welcome to our 10th podcast. If you've been following along, you know that on one night when we recorded 3 different podcasts, my computer was installing updates and it dropped the audio a couple times. So if you are new to this podcast, just be aware that about 3 times I'm going to have to voice over some audio because it drops out. And so I just want to fill you in on what we're saying. That'll happen on Zach a couple times. It sounds a little weird, but other than that, the audio is good, so please enjoy episode 10.
Michael H. Mott. I don't know what the H stands for, but we share Google Docs.
Yeah.
So don't tell me. I like the mystery.
Okay.
I'll guess your name every time. Michael Harry Mott.
Like, you want cold, warm?
Yeah.
Warm.
I'm getting there.
Yeah, warm.
Michael Henry Mott.
And the colder. Harry is pretty close.
Michael Harvey.
No, Harry is very close.
Harriet's a girl's name, right?
Harriet is a girl's name.
Harry, help me out, man.
Han Solo. I gave you a Star Wars reference.
I don't know Lord of the Rings. I don't know Star Wars. I don't know Harry Potter.
Indiana Jones.
Are you trying to get the Harrison?
Harrison.
There we go. See, Indiana Jones is where that's a better.
Yeah.
Well, Michael Harrison Mott.
Would it surprise you?
That since the first Bible translation in like the 1500s.
English one?
In English.
Yeah.
What if I told you since then we've had over 900 English translations?
Whoa. I would be shocked by that.
It's a big number, and there's so many translations. Everyone has a different preferred one. I know there's maybe 10 or 12 major ones, but there's been many over the years. How do you know this one's a good one? This one's not a good one. Should I use this one? Is this one permissible? Maybe for Bible study, should I preach from this one? There's a lot of questions to consider. So that's what we want to answer on today's Take 2 episode is what's up with Bible translation and how can we benefit from it?
Yeah, so let's get into that.
Let's take it. From the hearts of the Low Country in South Carolina.
It's the Take 2 podcast, where we take theology to the next level.
All right, Bible translation. I'm going to just from the get-go, I want to say this book because I took a lot of information from it. So I want to give credit where credit is due. The book is called How to Understand and Apply the New Testament's 12 Steps from Exegesis to Theology. It's by this guy named Andrew Naselli. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not.
I'm not. The one we use a couple. One was How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, and maybe How to Read the Bible Like Literature. There were a couple that we had in seminary masters that we.
This one's this guy. I think he's a little bit newer. I like him mainly because I love John Piper, and he's the New Testament professor at John Piper School, and so
Piper or Grudem.
Oh, sorry, this is at Piper School.
No, I'm saying you. Piper
me.
Or Grudem.
Oh, which one? I love Piper's heart for things.
Yeah.
I think Grudem thinks pretty cerebral. Like I think intellectually sometimes I align with Grudem, but I just love Piper's honesty. Like even if he's wrong on something, he truly believes it, and he believes it to the 100th degree. And he's given his life to it. And I'm like, man, that's where I can learn a little bit. But just to jump into big picture, what is a Bible translation? Simply you're looking at the original languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and you're putting it into English for our purposes. And there are a few things that every Bible translator is trying to do. They're trying to be accurate. That can mean a lot of things. Is word for word more accurate? Is thought for thought more accurate? The main goal of a translation is to accurately reproduce its meaning. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Because if you read, interlinear or something, it doesn't read well.
Oftentimes it does not, especially if you're reading the Old Testament and everything's backwards.
This doesn't make sense. So it is a science, but it's also an art. So you want to be accurate. You want to be clear, because if you're not clearly communicating words, you might be accurate, but the words aren't landing with your audience. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good. You want to be natural. I think that's where a lot of these modern translations come in, and some come into favor, fall out of favor? How much do you try to reach people where they're at, where the English language is at? And then the last one is to be audience appropriate, that different translations, with this in mind, they might have a different focus. It's not even that this translation is a bad translation. It might be, what is the goal of this translation? Is it accomplishing its goal? Is it communicating what the text says to its intended audience? And then I just threw this little graphic in here that I know you guys can't see, but it's from christianbook.com, this Christian book distributor.
I can through the power of the green screen. Well, even if it's not there, I guess I could put something up there if we decide to. But I will endeavor to put this up there.
And I don't know how accurate this is, where literacy levels change over the years, but they try to sell a lot of Bibles, so they're trying to help out the customer by saying, hey, if you read the King James Version, that's really on a 12th grade reading level. If you're looking at something like the New Living Translation, it's on a 6th grade reading level. Something you might want to consider, maybe you don't, but I think it kind of helps put in perspective that different translations have different literacy kind of places where they land in. And a good place to start before I'll kick it over to you is no one translation can do all of these like to the T. So it's always a give and take. It's, do I go into this pro? I might be opening myself up to this con. Maybe this is really good for this audience, maybe not for this audience, that there is this tension. You have to pick and choose. No one's going to nail it perfectly for every single person.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. And I would say that I am actually KJV only with all of my audiences who are 300 years old or older.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So I strictly use KJV for those folks.
For the if time machine, someone comes and be like, hey, I got something for you. You from the 1600s? Boom.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And maybe you can walk us through really the big tension is on one side you have formal equivalence, this word for word, and on the other side you have functional equivalence, this thought for thought.
Yeah, so I think most people, and I grew up, and I guess I should say something real quick as a big parenthesis, because my wife said to me, Michael, I want to be able to share your podcast to my family and places where you grew up, but you dig on our church so much. And I was like, I don't think I really do, but I think I dig more on the time frame, not necessarily, because it's like, we all, I grew up, my elementary years were in the 80s, so I don't want to tell you, but my my high school, middle school years were in the 90s. So that was just a different time period. So I'm not trying to dig on that church. And in fact, some of the churches I reference, or even the church I went to as a very young child, not
different
even
church.
Yeah, a different church.
So if Michael is talking bad about your church, it's not your church.
Right.
It's the other church.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, because I think if you're in a conservative Bible-believing church, there's a lot of themes that run consistently.
Yeah, that ran during that time period. And so like the church that I go to now, probably if I had grown up at CBC, I would say, well, when I was younger. So I'm not trying to but I would say that I think that most people, and this is the way it was when I grew up, they wanted an exact word-for-word translation because they trusted that we were going to get exactly what was said. And when I grew up, it was like KJV, and then this NIV thing came out. Like we were in the middle of Arkansas, very rural, very agrarian place. So, but I just wasn't exposed to these other translations. Maybe I could have gone to a Bible bookstore, but it just wasn't on my radar to go look. So the first thing that showed up was the NIV, and then of course everyone was saying, now that's going to be more of a thought for thought than the KJV, because so now we may not know that we're actually getting God's word, and so that you have this tension there between that formal equivalence, word for word, or that functional equivalence, thought for thought.
Yeah. And I think, you give up stuff in both that, a classic English word for word translation is the NASB, and it is great for word studies. It's what our church preaches from the pulpit. I think the downside of it is people criticize it for being wooden or awkward. It doesn't read well. It's not smoothed out. But on the positive side, it's not taking interpretive liberties that you're no matter what you do in a translation, you have to interpret, but you do much less of it when you go word for word than thought for thought.
Right. And even you have this idea of the Greek word sarx, which gets It can just mean sin. It can mean just mean my body, or it can mean like sinful flesh. And so, like even in the NASB, I think that there's places where they translate it as sin nature, or and I'm probably speaking out of kin here. Maybe it's not, but that can be a difficult word. What you're talking about, just how do we translate?
I agree. Even going through Romans, you're like, okay, is he talking? Like sometimes he's talking about flesh, human person, and then other times he's his flesh. It's sinfulness. I think that's a really good example of that. So where if you're going really thought for thought, you've got to make those interpretive decisions where in the word for word, you can see what the word is and work with it.
And one other point I was going to make of the book that I had read, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, they make the point that sometimes a word for word can actually be harmful because if you have certain idioms that don't translate well, then you're giving, and if you're not a ancient Near Eastern scholar, you're not going to understand what this idiom says, and you might actually take it to mean something different.
That is worst case scenario, and I which is it's a good thing to bring up. I'm thinking of if I'm writing something and I'm like, man, cat got his tongue, and it's going into someplace 500 years in the future in an Asian language or something. They might be like, why is a cat? It's actually makes it more challenging. It gets in the way of meaning. And idioms, that's a good thing we'll talk about that. It's as a translator, you got to make a choice. Do I interpret this? Do I do a little footnote? What do I do to communicate this accurately? And then I make fun of the CSB for this. I think the CSB is a good translation, but their PR team is awesome. They're like, we do this, these optimal equivalents. We don't do dynamic or formal. We're optimal. We're in the middle. And I'm like, man, that is a good marketing move.
It is very good. And I like the CSB.
I like it too.
I adopted it as my carry to church Bible for probably a year. And then we started memorizing again. And I just couldn't start memorizing from the CSB. Hopefully I'm not skipping around on.
No, you're good. No, it's called payback. I deserve it.
But the KJV, like I had so many, you were talking about a couple podcasts ago, Awana, you had all these KJV verses memorized. Well, we had verse memorization. It was a great thing that my old church did. Where we had to, we would do these competitions. That's all KJV.
Yeah.
And then when I came to CBC, it was like all NASB, and I was like, I don't want to start another translation of memorizing from the CSB. So that's why I was eventually
that's the kicker. I went to the ESV for memorization, so it's even. Like I should go NASB because we're like all trying to memorize Romans 1:16 to 17, and they're very similar, but just enough where it's tough. But big picture is that all of these different approaches, they have a purpose. They can be valid and useful, strengths and weaknesses. Because if you've taken any Spanish class, you quickly know that words don't go one for one. That when you do that, it's awkward no matter what. So let's just run through some of these Bible translations quickly. We'll start with most literal, most word for word, and work our way through. I'm not hitting all of the translations, just some of the big ones you might run across. New American Standard Bible. The criticism is that it's hard to read. It's awkward, but it's so close. Even the way the Greek reads, it tries to, hit that same syntax. Next on this spectrum, we have the ESV. It's pretty word for word.
Yeah, and one of the criticisms is that it's Zach's favorite.
For me, I grew up in a church that was not KJV only, but it was KJV heavily preferred, and we were very wary of this crazy NIV version that did remove verses, and I was really discouraged from reading the NIV. I wasn't familiar with a lot. The NASB was like okay, but everything else, I just, like you're saying, not on my radar. I went to college at a Christian school, and it's like all these people are reading the ESV. It was like all the church I went to is using the ESV. I'm like, what is this? If you know, Patch the Pirate, I don't know if you're familiar with him or not. I visited his church for a little bit, and they were in the process of voting on what they're changing the KJV to what version. ESV was on the table, NASB was on the table. They went with the NKJV at the time.
NKJV, yeah.
And I wasn't a member or anything, but I was like observing the voting process. I was like, Patch, go with the ESV. But anyway, as we work our way farther down,
KJV.
It's very close, but it's on the of the word for word, which people might not realize that. I mean, it's on the word for word side. But the NASB and the ESV are really more. It's kind of close with the ESV. And I didn't read this. I wanted to, the translator's preface to the KJV, but it was too hard to read with the language. Because what people say is their whole philosophy is put it in the tongue of the modern person.
Right.
Get the word out. Right. That's their goal. Some of the kind of undermine some of the KJV only people, that even their argument from the translators. And then we get to Michael H. Mott's CSB, that optimal. It's kind of situated really nicely.
Yeah, and one comment, what I really liked about the CSB, and you were talking about Grudem and Piper, cerebral both versus emotional. I think I fall into the cerebral category, and therefore, I don't know that it's therefore, but for me, Psalms have been more of a difficult thing. And I know that some people are like, oh, I live and die in the Psalms, I read them. But I felt like the CSB's translations of the Psalms made them come alive more to me. I don't know why, but it seemed like that. So if I go read a Psalm, I'm likely to read it in the CSB.
No, that's really cool. I did not have a lot of experience with the CSB. I know you were making a big deal about it. I read it a little bit. We did this Roman study partly in the CSB, just trying to expose our people to different translations to see pros and cons. Like you can see this is not the same. Maybe you don't want to do everything here, but read it. And there were a lot of areas I was like, wow, this is it helps me understand versus I've read a million times. Even I think, in the ESV or KJV, they use the word propitiation, and the CSB uses mercy seat, or it has these like word pictures. I'm like, oh, that's a really good picture to put in there from the Old Testament. But as we keep moving down this spectrum, we get to the NIV, New International Version. Reads really well, much more thought for thought. We're starting to get on that thought for thought spectrum.
And I wonder, because there is I think there's a 2020 version of the NIV.
Yeah.
And at least according to the revised version of How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, they pull their NIV 2020 is their preferred translation.
Oh, and I'm not.
So I wonder if it moved up the scale a little bit to more word for word. I don't know.
Yeah, I have to do some more.
If the older one, and I guess that one was done in the 90s or the 80s, the first NIV.
I want to say, because they were kind of the first to, like you were saying, first to market for these modern translations. Right. So maybe even the 80s. I honestly, I'm in the NASB, ESV, CSB. I'm like, I need to read, and I'm actually, the next one I have read a lot more is the NLT, New Living Translation. It's a really good translation, but it's really thought for thought. You just need to know that, but it is helpful in areas.
Yeah, and there's part of me that emotionally likes some of the formal rigidity of the Bible, and I don't want my Bible reading like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or
Amen.
Or
I'm right there with you.
Any other novel.
Yeah.
And to me, the NLT reads more almost like a novel.
It feels like it's very liberal with that kind of stuff, which I really do like going back and maybe reading some Old Testament narratives. That kind of helps me put the big picture, but then kind of fill in the gaps and be like, okay, maybe we're just being a little loose here.
Right.
But the takeaway is you just need to know that's what they're doing. If you don't know that's what they're doing, you could get some of the wrong ideas in mind. And then way on the one side of the spectrum is the Message, which basically is a paraphrase, and because it even updates the historical context, cultural context, and they make it modern. Right. So you're not even trying, you're trying to make it understandable, but you're saying things very modernly. Right. I think the example I came across here was I got not to get away from the mic too much, but it says something like in 1 Corinthians 13, a more formal translation, like the NASB will say, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. But the Message says, I'm a rusty gate. Like you're using like a different analogy because you might think cymbals are hard, so let's do a modern thing, and so you're losing a lot of the original. It's kind of weird,
trying to
right?
Make sense of the rusty gate. I guess my band, background, and you were in band too. Like those noisy cymbal or clanging gong, that makes perfect sense to me. But I guess if you didn't have a band background, then
everyone's got a rusty gate in their yard. So and so that kind of stuff is done a lot. Where some of these more thought for thought, I don't know that I would like that being preached from the pulpit, because I feel like you would be undermining the translation when you talk like this is what it means. This is what you're doing a lot of.
It's almost like a commentary at some level. Yeah.
Which is very useful.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I don't want people to think, man, these are not useful. Like it's good to read commentaries to help shed some light, just kind of know what's happening.
Right.
Here, right.
We want to again, like we want to base our our rule of law on what was written. Yeah.
And then one last thing I'll say, because this is like, to me, it's like, oh, I didn't realize this, but the NASB is more literal as a rule than the ESV. But there are places where the ESV is more literal than the NASB. And there's even places where the NIV is more literal than the NASB. It's just not generally. You get these translation committees, and maybe the person on Isaiah in this one verse picks a translation that's a little bit more literal. And there in this book, there's a ton of examples. But one that I thought was interesting to kind of pull out was talking about this. I'm having a hard time finding it here, but in the ESV, you might have, it says that some have died, where in the NASB, a little bit more literal here, even in the KJV, it says, fell asleep or something like that, where they're trying to make it more modern, that it's, when you think of fall asleep.
So was the original Greek asleep or died?
So the NIV, the original Greek is sleep. NIV uses sleep.
Okay.
ESV uses died with a footnote saying sleep, which I think is helpful.
Right.
But even in thinking of a example like that, if you don't understand that, totally died makes sense. But why might it be important that someone fell asleep? Is that they will wake up? There's there's meaning underneath that you lose when you over translate it. That I think that's some of the stuff you run the risk of. But that's a place where the NIV is more literal than the ESV, and there's a lot of examples. It's just kind of the rule. I'm probably not going to get into all of the weeds here, but we talked about some of these, idioms, metaphors, similes that when you're translating, it's really good things to keep in mind. And I think the good translations will do kind of what we talked about. They'll say something and footnote it.
Right.
So look at those footnotes.
Right.
Actually, maybe even read the introduction to your translator's notes or whatever.
Well, and I think another thing that you come across, and I don't know how you would translate around this because I don't see it here. I guess it would fall under idiom, but you have like, Moses saying he was the most humble person. Or you have Solomon being declared the wisest person. And so you have this way of talking about people. And that was basically an idiom to say they were very, very humble. They were very, very wise. In our modern ear, we take it, that's a superlative. It must mean that there was no one more wise ever. And it can be really strong, but that's just how they spoke to kind of get that meaning across. And so you have, it's a different culture. So you have a different time periods. There's difficulties in trying to translate it, and you got to make decisions on how we do it.
And so you can't, at the end of the day, if you're doing in-depth Bible study, hopefully if you're sitting under preaching, you're doing all of these other, your pastor is doing these other things to help bring that context into it, because you're not going to pick up on all of this from a translation alone. Another idiom I was looking up here, in the KJV, talks about girding up the loins of your mind.
There you go.
And I love, girding up my loins as much as the next guy. Am I right, Michael?
I mean, that's what we do. Like every Sunday, we're like, all right, man, let's gird up the loins of our minds. So we get there.
And the ESV would say something like, prepare your minds for action. Or I think the NASB says that too, but again, they use a footnote and they say, hey, girding up your loins literally is what it is. And to me, I love that side of things where you kind of get both and you're like, okay, I don't know what this means, but I guess it was an expression for something they said a lot. You got to do something with money, weights, and measures. This is always confusing to me.
Oh, yeah.
So what do you pick? What decision do you make?
Yeah, I remember having some in-depth conversations about this, and I think there is, I think probably the best is to put the historically accurate one in there and then footnote it as maybe a common, like a cubit, and then you say a cubit's about 18 inches, or a
denarii. Where you keep that literal.
Denarii, about a day's wages,
That, to me, that is better than the flip of that, because then it gets confusing too with some of that if you're not looking at a footnote or something that kind of helps set you straight.
I would even like for all the people that are listening to this who are on a translation committee, and you're just looking for good ideas for that next translation. In the book of Numbers, I'm not saying don't do anything different than the words, but give me a page that just has a graph or a chart of all of the different tribes, like every time, because there's
you can
2 or 3 different times, and you reading through and you see these numbers and you see all the sons of Reuben and all the sons of Simeon. Yeah, that's for the next translation.
Get it together, Bible translation committees. Speaking of good marketing by the CSB, man, Christian Standard Bible. You couldn't name a better Bible. The Christian. It's like, man, someone should have been on that a little bit sooner.
Yeah,
that was a good.
Well, it was the Holman Standard.
Good idea to drop that Holman. That was smart.
Get rid of Holman, adding Christian. That's good.
With other translation difficulties are things like euphemisms. You talk about sexual acts, or talking about using the restroom. How real are you? How offensive? How dignified do you want to be?
Right, because some people would argue that Paul cussed.
Yeah.
But we don't know. Some would say Jesus cussed when he called them vipers and
it was strong language.
To call someone an animal was very strong back then. It just wasn't heard of. Some of the euphemisms I think confused. Like I look at Noah. Who was it? It was Ham, but what was Ham's? Canaan was Ham's son, and it so Ham uncovers the nakedness of his father.
Yeah, it's kind of obscure. Yeah,
what's going on? Like a lot of people argue that Ham's son had a relationship with Noah's mom.
Because you look at
Noah's wife.
You look in Leviticus, and it kind of makes that connection, but without that,
but it doesn't make any of the sense of the other two covering up the Noah's nakedness. But like, so some of these euphemisms, we don't know, like, because I don't know what was going on.
And then how transparent or dignified do you want a translation? Here's a verse in Acts 8:20. It talks about this. What was this guy's name? Sorcerer, magician. Is it Simon? I don't know, who thought he could buy.
Oh, this is 1 Samuel?
Sorry, I'm going Acts 8:20.
Okay. Yeah.
And in NASB, it'll say something like, "But Peter said to him, 'May your silver perish with you, because you thought you could obtain the gift of God with money.'" But something like the Message will say something like, "Peter said, 'To hell with your money, and you along with it.'" Really trying to bring that strong emphasis.
Right.
And it's like, do you want that in your translation? You want to communicate that it's strong, but you don't want to be offensive. You want to be able to read it.
Certain preachers want that in their translation,
and so that's
the ones that cuss from the pulpit.
So that's a tension where you want to be able to say, man, being very strong here, but maybe you don't want to be super transparent. I don't know if you want to hit the 1 Samuel passage there.
I was looking at your reference because sometimes I prepare the outline, sometimes Zach prepares the outline. So I'm guessing this is Nabal, right?
Yeah.
Is this Nabal where David and Abigail?
I think so. Yeah. Yes.
And so the NASB is "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." NLT is "You stupid son of a whore." I guess is that more literal, or are they just trying to bring it into the context?
I think they're. I think they're.
Rebellious woman is
yes. And they're using.
And then what's this LB?
I think it's the Living Bible, which is it's like way on the paraphrase spectrum.
So in Arkansas, I won't say the exact words here, but in Arkansas we would say "You son of a biscuit eater." You can see how they translated it there. But yes,
and they would
that
say
would be pretty jarring. Yeah,
and because Saul was probably very upset, or saying this kind of thing. So you're trying to communicate. It's got the exclamation point on there, and these other ones, like it's a strong thing, but that might not come across in some of these literal translations. But you just need to know this is a strong.
I wondered if there would be a way to indicate that this was very jarring with
translation committee. Hope you're listening.
Without making it jarring, and maybe maybe we're just too Victorian in our sensibilities, and we need to
toughen up.
I don't know,
because I would like to know it's strong, but I get trying to, you're trying to read a passage in a service or something. Another area to consider that I think gets criticism, maybe unjustly, is this gender accuracy. I wonder what your thoughts are. But a lot of these words literally translated are men or man, when really they might be addressed. Maybe Paul's addressing a whole congregation, but he says brothers. Is he saying, hey, this is not going out to women at all? Galatians is only for men. So is it okay for a translation to say brothers and sisters? I'm talking to all of you. Or is it, some people get really bent out of shape and say, well, it's brothers. I think a lot of these translations might italicize it, have a footnote say, literally brothers. Paul's probably talking to the entire church, not limiting.
I think, well, the NASB, which is what we say is very, very, very literal. But even, I believe it's Ephesians 3:21, where Paul starts a prayer there, and he says, I bow my knee before the Father, from whom every family on earth derives its name. We have, even in there, an example of what you're talking about, because the word for family should actually be translated fatherhood.
Oh, gotcha.
It's like from, and it's so from all, and it's really the root of the patriarchy.
Oh,
so,
there you go.
So it would
You've really
be very
offended some
pokey.
people. Yeah.
So I think, man, I think they got 321 wrong.
Because literally, it's almost like they should say that and maybe they should indicate like maybe what they're trying. I mean, in that sense, wrong, but maybe in these other senses, like brothers and sisters. Or do you think, no, Paul really meant only the men should listen to what's in this letter, and they should, teach it to their families on their own, kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it's probably you have to read the context. And again, like we said, you're making some decisions when you translate. You're making some theological decisions when you make a translation. But I think 321 should be just the
fatherhood or something like that.
And then maybe these others, brothers and sisters, is fine, and probably put it in italics
and kind of give something like that. Here's another one for you. These are referred to as masculine resumption pronouns, and essentially it's maybe the exact wording is, this is a modern example, but you might say everyone turn off their phones. Grammatically not correct. You say everyone turn off his phones. And so they'll use similar. I don't have a great example. I should have written some down from scripture, but where it's a singular, but they're saying it's just to everyone just for flow of conversation, but really it should be more specific.
Yeah, I would be fine with, again, his phone or whatever, and then maybe footnote it, or his/her, and put the her in italics, so that you're just letting the reader know. In the original language, it said his, but all bets point to that it's everyone.
I like that. So I think I'm with you where err on the literal, and maybe put a note explaining this is the thinking, but it's this is interpretation. This is literally what it says.
And you could. So there's, I don't know if you had this in there, because I thought there was some verb thing that we may have skipped over. But so lots of translations, when we tell a story, we'll say, Jesus said this, Peter said this, then Jesus walked here. But when they wrote it originally, they put that all in present tense. Jesus says, Peter says, he walked. And so I believe it's NASB just puts an asterisk there. And then they have a note at the very beginning, so that they don't have all of these footnotes every time that happens. They put an asterisk and they say, whenever you see this, we have put this in the verb tense that would make sense to us, but the original would have been a present tense. So you could do something similar potentially with these pronouns as well.
Here's one more, and this is where it gets a little tricky too. You read somewhere like in Psalm 32, it'll say in the NASB, blessed is he, literally, blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Paul in Romans 4:6-7 is quoting this, but instead of saying blessed is he, which is what the Greek text says, he'll say blessed are those. He'll pluralize a lot of these singular male things in the Old Testament, and he'll say, I'm making these plural because I'm applying them to men and women.
I'm going to ask a question, and it's okay if you don't know the answer. But I know sometimes it looks like Paul's misquoting or changing a quote because he's quoting from the Septuagint, and we don't translate. So do we know if the Septuagint is singular or plural?
That is a good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
Wherever at.
Yeah.
I don't guess it really matters because either the translators of the Septuagint or Paul looked at that and went from singular to plural. So I think the point remains. I was just curious as whether it was...
Because he does this a lot. Maybe we can fact check it on the next episode or something, but it's very frequently, it's always taking a singular masculine pronoun and making it a plural in the New Testament. But I know what you're saying. Like a lot of times these New Testament writers, they're drawing from the Septuagint almost exclusively.
Right.
Like that's what they were using and that's what they were familiar with.
Yeah.
So something to check out. I think a good talking point on footnotes is you should really just read the intro. I think a lot of people don't. Like the CSB has different rules than the NASB and the ESV of what their philosophy is and how they indicate different things, whether it's italics or all caps or bold. I think CSB bolds Old Testament quotation, and it's different in different translations that
you can
take
have
5 minutes to read those.
The small caps for the name of the Lord, the proper name. So instead of saying Yahweh, they would just write LORD, which is different than normal writing, like lowercase. So,
which the Legacy Standard Bible, they just say Yahweh everywhere, which I think is I like that move. I wish more people did that move.
What about this song that Chris Tomlin sings called Yahweh? And he goes, Yahweh, Yahweh. And I'm like, I don't know. It just feels a little too...
Yeah, I'll have to listen to that song, but you heard it here first. Chris Tomlin, we're gunning for you at CBC. No, we use a lot of your songs, so I'm sure you're watching.
You're good. One last pronoun thing that I think we lose sometimes is the plural second person. Ooh. So if you're in the South, it's easy.
Right.
Y'all.
Easy, yeah.
Y'all. Yeah. If you're in the North, like a lot of my Michigander relatives, it's you guys. You guys. You got some pop, you guys. But nice. This is another request to translators. When it is in the Greek a plural second person, indicate that to us as English readers. Don't just translate that as you, because it makes a difference in how that is interpreted.
This is like a good KJV got it right. I mean, it's helpful, right? In this area, right?
Yeah. What is it? Ye?
Yeah, ye. Yeah, so you know. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're reading KJV and it says ye, it's a plural you. Yeah.
And so that is helpful because that changes who we talking to.
Right,
what's this mean? So before we move into just a 2-minute overview, takeaways, anything you want to add, anything we missed going through translations?
No, and I think you covered it. And I said in our last podcast, and the last podcast we talked about, translations and stuff. It was the one on the
textual criticism.
That the best translation is the one that you'll read. So if there's one that you like that you find easy to read it over and over again. I had mentioned maybe 3 podcasts ago, I don't know, that summer that when we took a month, some of the more godly men at our church,
AKA he's calling me out, did not participate.
We took a month where we committed to read through the book of Romans once a day, every day. And I started out, and for 2 weeks, I did the whole book of Romans for like 14 days. But even like on day 3, I was like, I can't do NASB every time. So I started switching up to different translations, and it helped. And then after 2 weeks, I was like, I cannot do all 16 chapters all the time. It feels like it's just going by so fast. So, but the point of all that is, you can use more than one translation in your Bible study. You can.
You probably should.
Yeah.
That give those shades of meaning, and it helps you understand. You're like, oh, they were going this way with it when you see 3 different words that are similar, but maybe pointing you in a different way than you thought it meant. I think that's really helpful. And I've been trying to read more translations and just knowing their philosophy. It's like look up who's on these committees too. Like the NLT, very thought for thought. It's like 90 scholars, and it's like, you would recognize 5 or 6 of these people, and half of these people are on the other translation committees anyway. They're the experts in the languages, and you're like, wow, this is not just like thrown together haphazardly. And Michael, we were talking. He's taken a semester of Greek. I've audited Greek, which is even less because I didn't take tests or anything. And I had this illusion that I could just get my NA 28 or my UBS 5 critical text, and I'll be doing my devotions. I'll follow along with Pastor Joel.
And you can, as long as it's all nouns.
Yeah. Once you're like, oh, these verb tenses, and this is crazy. And you quickly realize, man, very limited in my understanding. And I don't know those shades or the context, and gives you a lot more appreciation for these translating committees. And we look at, in English, we've got so many. We should be thankful where these other people groups have nothing, or one, we really have an embarrassment of riches that we should thank God. Use them. Just know where they're coming from, and if you kind of know that helps put it in perspective. At the end of the day, one last note I have: Bible translations are remarkably similar. If I have my ESV and church, Pastor Joel's preaching from the NASB, it's basically the same.
Right.
The difference is like 2 or 3 words, and a lot of times it's 2 instead of 4. It's a preposition.
Right.
And they're really not that different. Now, the message is a little different than NASB.
Yeah. I wouldn't, unless your church has adopted the message as their standard Bible, I wouldn't suggest bringing the message and trying to follow along.
Yeah, that's
would
where
be
it gets
rough.
a little bit more challenging. But that's all I got. What do you got, Michael?
I think that's it. There was one other minor point, but it's escaped
you.
It's escaped me.
It's gone.
It's gone. So
all right. Well,
that's our take. All right. See you.
Thanks for listening to Take 2. Find us wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube for those who want to watch our videocast.